I was killed on the A38 by a driver awake 19 hours, and I came back 11 months earlier knowing his name. It took me until March to work out that the name was the one they gave me to stop me looking. I came back standing in the traffic office with a mug in my hand and the kettle still going behind me at 7:20 in the morning on the 9th of January, and the first thing I did was not scream, it was look at the whiteboard. That is the kind of person I am, and it is the reason for everything that follows, both the good and the part I am ashamed of. The whiteboard had 22 trucks on it, and the loads for the day, and a column for the drivers, and I stood there in a coat I had thrown out in the spring, and read a board I had read 400 times, and I got to line 11, and line 11 said Petch, Avonmouth, 0530, and I felt my whole body go cold in a way I have never felt before or since, because I had seen that name at an inquest. I had sat in a coroner's court, or rather I had not, because you do not attend your own, but I had known, in the way you know things when you are dead, and it turns out that being dead is mostly knowing things you cannot use, that the finding was driver fatigue, and the driver was Ryan Petch, and he had been on duty 19 hours across a split that had been falsified. Dilly's Ambler, who ran the traffic desk next to mine for 6 years, said, "You're pouring that on the counter, Marn." I was. I had poured about half a pint of boiling water onto the counter and my own hand, and had not noticed, and I have a mark on the back of that hand now, small, white, in the shape of nothing at all, and I have never once been able to look at it without going straight back to a whiteboard at 7:20 on the 9th of January. I said I had not slept. She said, "You want to get off the road then?" Which is a joke in a haulage office, and which was the single funniest thing anybody has ever said to me, and I could not explain why to anybody for 2 years. Then I went into the ladies, and sat on the closed lid of a toilet in a depot in Gloucestershire, and worked out, in about 4 minutes, what I had. I had a date, which was the 22nd of November. I had a road, which was the A38 north of Almondsbury. I had a time, which was about 6:10 in the evening, in the dark, in rain. I had a name, and I had 11 months, which sounds like an enormous amount, and which is, I can now tell you, about 4 months less than you need. I knew what the inquest was going to say. That is the whole of my advantage, laid out honestly, and I want you to see how thin it actually is, because everybody who hears this story assumes that coming back is like being handed a file. It is not. It is like being handed a headline. I knew the finding. I did not know the evidence. I knew that a coroner in a room in Flaxborden had said the words driver fatigue, and I knew the driver's name, and I knew that his hours had been wrong, and everything else in my head was not knowledge, it was atmosphere. It was the shape a story takes when it has been through 400 people, and a local paper, and a family, and a company statement, and I built 7 months on it. Here is what I actually did between January and July, and I am going to be specific because the specificity is the confession. I pulled Ryan Petch's tachograph data every week and I read it myself instead of letting the analysis bureau do it. And I found what I expected to find, which is that his charts were a mess, missing mileage, unrecorded other work, 4 occasions where the card was pulled and the vehicle moved. I logged every one of them. I made a folder. In March, I moved him off nights, which he was furious about, because nights pay a premium and he has a daughter, and I did it on a pretext about a license check that I invented. In April, I put him on a 2-hourly check-in, which no other driver at that firm has ever had to do, and which the other drivers noticed, and which made him a joke in the yard for about 6 weeks. And in June, I sat in Dean Bellamy's office and told the owner of the company that, in my professional opinion, Ryan Petch was a driver we could not defend, and that we should manage him out before he hurt somebody. Dean said, "On what?" And I said, "On the charts." And Dean Bellamy, who is not a clever man and who is not a bad one either, said the thing that should have stopped me and did not, which was, "Everybody's charts look like that, Marn. Have you looked at anybody else's?" I had not. That is the answer. I had 11 months to prevent my own death, and I spent 7 of them building a case against one man because I had arrived carrying his name, and I never once opened another driver's file because I was not investigating. I was confirming. Ryan Petch was 29. He has a daughter called Immy, who was 4 that year, and who he had every other weekend, and one Wednesday, and the Wednesday is why he wanted nights, because nights finished at 4 and he could do the school run at 1:30. He is not an easy man. He is the kind of driver who reads the working time directive for fun, so he can quote it at you. He had 2 grievances in on me by August, and both of them were correct, and one of them I still think about. He kept every piece of paper he had ever been given at that company in a carrier bag, which everybody in the yard knew about and laughed at, and which is the single most important object in this story. And in May, on a Tuesday, in the yard, in front of about 6 people, after I had told him he was on a 2-hourly check-in for another month, he said, "What is it you think I've done?" And I could not answer him, because the answer was, "You are going to kill me in November," and there is no version of that sentence that does not end with me in a room being assessed. So I said it was a compliance matter, which is a thing that means nothing, and he said, "You've had it in for me since January." And I said that was not true, and it was true. It was the truest thing anybody said in that yard all year, and he knew the month. He had noticed the month. A man who I had decided was careless enough to kill somebody had noticed, to within a fortnight, when a person's behavior toward him had changed, and I stood there and looked at him and thought, that is not a careless man, and then I put the thought away, because I had 7 months invested in it. I should say what I was, before, so you know what was actually lost. I was a transport manager, which is a licensed statutory role and not a job title, and I had held it for 9 years, and I was good at it. I did my CPC at 26, at night, in a porta-cabin in Bridgewater, while working days on a trunk desk, and I came top of that cohort, and I have never once mentioned that to anybody at work. My father drove for a living, and my grandfather drove for a living, and my grandfather's license is in a frame in my hall, and the family joke, which stopped being funny in about 2019, is that I was the one who went into the office. I have refused loads. That is the whole of the job, in the end. On a Friday at 4, when the customer is screaming and the only driver left has 4 hours and the run needs 6, you either say no or you become something else, and I had said no maybe 200 times in 9 years, and I was proud of it in a way I did not examine. And it turns out that being the person who says no about hours makes you completely blind to a person who is quietly not saying anything about breaks. And there was a thing with Dilly's in 2021 where she came to me about a driver she thought was drinking, and I said we needed more than a feeling. And I was right, and he was, and he hit a bollard in Redditch 11 weeks later, and nobody was hurt. And I have used that story on myself for 4 years as evidence that I do not act on feelings. In January, I acted on a feeling for 7 months and called it evidence, and the only difference is that this time the feeling arrived from a direction that made it impossible to question. Here is what I would say to anybody who has ever been certain about somebody. Certainty is not a feeling that arrives when you have enough evidence. It is a feeling that arrives first and then goes looking, and it is very hard to tell from the inside, and I had the most powerful possible version of it because mine had come from the future and I could not even ask myself where I had got it. A driver signs a walk-around check every morning. That is the law, and it is the most boring sentence in this entire account, and it is the one the whole thing turns on. Before a heavy goods vehicle moves, the driver walks around it and checks a list, lights, tires, leaks, load security, brakes, and signs a sheet, and if there is a defect, he records it, and the vehicle does not move until it is dealt with, and that sheet is a legal document. At Bellamy Freight, the sheets came off a pad. In July, for a completely unrelated reason, which was a customer complaint about a curtain side that had come loose on the M5. I went into the maintenance office to pull 3 months of walkaround sheets, and Gordon Leask was not in, and the pad was on the desk, and I picked it up. And the top sheet was blank, and the second sheet was blank, and the third sheet was blank, and then, about 40 sheets down, there were 9 consecutive completed sheets, for 9 different vehicles, on 9 different dates spread across 5 weeks, all filled in and signed, and 9 different signatures, in the same pen, in the same hand. I stood in that office for a long time, because there is only one way that happens. Somebody sits down on a wet Thursday and fills in 5 weeks of walk-around checks in one go, doing all the signatures from a pad that never left the office for trucks that were checked by nobody. And once I had seen it, I could not unsee it, and I went and got the defect records. And the defect records for that fleet across 2 years show 41 defects reported, and the national average for a fleet that size is somewhere north of 400. Bellamy Freight was reporting 1/10 of the defects it should have been reporting, because the men who would have reported them were not walking around the trucks, because their checks were being written for them in an office by a man who had decided at some point in about 2015 that this was more efficient. I did the wrong thing with it first, and I want that in, because everybody who tells you a story like this tells you about the clever move and not the stupid one. On the 11th of July, I took the pad to Gordon, not to Dean, not to anybody outside, to Gordon, in the maintenance office, with 2 mugs of tea, in the friendly voice, because I had known the man for 9 years, and because in my head at that point he was not a suspect. He was a colleague with a paperwork problem that I was going to help him tidy up before somebody outside noticed. And he was magnificent. He did not deny it for a second. He said, "Yeah, that's me." And he said it before I had finished the question, and then he explained, for about 11 minutes, that drivers will not do the checks, that he had spent 4 years trying, that he had put up laminated sheets and done toolbox talks and stood in the yard at 5 in the morning, and that in the end he had decided that a check written by the man who actually looks at the vehicles was worth more than a signature scribbled by a driver who is looking at his phone. And there is a version of that which is almost true. That is what made him what he was. And then he said, "And if the DVSA come in and see 40 blank sheets, this place shuts and everybody here loses their job, so what do you want me to do, Marn?" And I said I would think about it, and I went back to my office, and I did nothing. For 8 weeks. 8 weeks. That is on me, and it will always be on me. Gordon Leask has been fleet engineer there for 19 years. He is 61. He served his time at a bus company, and I want to be exact about this because it is the thing that took me longest to hold in my head, a genuinely excellent engineer. He can hear a wheel bearing going from the other side of a yard. He kept that fleet running through 2 recessions on a maintenance budget that was an insult. Everybody in that depot, including me, including the drivers who hated the paperwork, had spent years being quietly grateful to Gordon for making it all go away. I had spent 7 months on the wrong man. I found out on the 11th of September, in the maintenance records, and it took me about 90 seconds to go from a man I had decided was a killer to a woman who had nearly destroyed somebody. Vehicle KX 68 HRD, that is the unit that was going to be on the A38 on the 22nd of November. I pulled its complete history, because by then I was pulling everything, and it has an inspection sheet every 6 weeks going back 4 years, which is correct, and on 11 consecutive inspection sheets across 16 months, there is an advisory in the same box, and the advisory says, "Rear axle service brake performance below expected, monitor," and it is initialed GL, and on the 12th sheet the advisory is gone, and there is no repair, no parts, no invoice, nothing. It was not repaired. It was stopped being written down. And the brake test performance figures for that unit at its last annual test are 18% below the required service brake efficiency, and it passed because the test was done at a station where Gordon Leask has taken that fleet since 2011, and where his brother-in-law is the manager. And I am not going to pretend I proved that part, because I did not. The tribunal did, later, and it took them 2 years. So, on the 22nd of November, on a wet A38 in the dark, a truck with a bad rear axle, and a driver who has not walked around it because nobody at that company walks around anything is going to need to stop, and it is going to take about 11 meters longer than it should. And 11 meters is the entire difference between a story about a near miss and a coroner in Flaxborton saying the words driver fatigue. And here is the part that has kept me awake for 4 years. Petch's hours were still wrong. That was true. It was true in both versions. But his hours were wrong because Bellamy Freight ran a shift pattern that could not legally be completed, and every driver in that yard was falsifying to survive it, and the falsification was the reason the inquest had something to look at, and looking at it is the reason nobody ever looked at the breaks. I had come back from the dead carrying as memory the exact conclusion that a cover-up had been designed to produce. I did not have knowledge of the future. I had the press release. Sonia Bellamy came to my house on the 12th of September, and she is the reason I nearly did not make the phone calls. She does the wages and the HR, and she has known me since I was 24, and she came with a lasagne, which is what this part of the country does instead of speaking, and she sat in my kitchen, and she did not shout, and she did not threaten me, and she did the only thing that would have worked. She talked about my father. She said, your dad drove for Dean's dad for 11 years, which is true. She said, when he was ill in 2016, who kept him on the books, which is also true, and the answer is Dean, for 14 months, on light duties that did not exist, at full pay, and I have never had to say thank you for it, because in a firm like that you do not, and I have carried it since like a stone in a coat pocket. And then she said, so whatever it is you think Gordon's done, you understand what you'd be taking down, not Gordon. 30-odd families, at Christmas, in a town with no work in it. And I sat there in my own kitchen, and I could not breathe properly, because the thing about the emotional one, the thing nobody warns you about, is that she does not lie. Every fact she brought into that room was true, and every one of them was mine, and she had arranged them into a shape and handed it to me, and it fit my hands perfectly. I said, Sonia, how do you know I think Gordon's done anything? And she said, because you've been in the maintenance office 4 times in a fortnight, and Gordon tells me things. And I said, what does he tell you? And she stopped. She sat in my kitchen with her hands round a mug, and she stopped. And she was there another 20 minutes, and we talked about her daughter's wedding, and she left the lasagne, and at the door she said, Marnie, don't. And I said, I know, which is not the same as agreeing, and which she took as agreeing, and I did the phone calls 6 weeks later, and I have never once told her that the reason I hesitated for 4 weeks was her and not Gordon. I went to Ryan Petch's flat on the 14th of September, in the evening unannounced, which is not a thing a transport manager does, and he opened the door and looked at me and said, you're joking. And I said, I need to apologize to you, and it is going to take about 20 minutes, and I do not expect you to accept it. And he let me in, which I would not have done. His daughter was there. She was asleep in the other room, and he kept his voice down the entire time, and that detail undid me more than anything else that year. I told him everything except the part I cannot tell anybody. I told him that in January I had formed a view about him that was not based on evidence, that I had moved him off nights on a pretext, that the 2 hourly check-ins had been punitive, that his grievance in July had been correct, and that I had defended it dishonestly, and that I had sat in the owner's office in June and tried to have him managed out of a job. I did not soften any of it, and I did not explain it, because the only explanation available was a lie, or the truth, and both were unusable. And he sat there and let me finish, and then he said, why are you telling me now? And I said, because the thing I should have been looking at is the brakes on HRD, and I need somebody who has driven it. And Ryan Petch went into his bedroom and came out with a carrier bag, 4 years of it, every defect card he had ever written out and handed in duplicate, because he had been taught by an old boy at his first firm to always keep the yellow copy. And everybody at Bellamy had laughed at him about that bag for 4 years, including me, in the office, in front of other people, in 2022. 9 of those yellow copies are for KX68 HRD, and 7 of them mention the brakes, and the earliest is from 19 months before the date I was carrying in my head. He had reported it 7 times. Every single one of those reports had gone into that maintenance office and had come back as monitor, and after the 4th one he had stopped expecting anything and had kept writing them anyway. And when I asked him why he kept writing them if nothing happened, he said, so that when it happens, it's not going to be me. Thank you for listening to Channel Crystal Novel. The download was the 14th of November, 8 days before. I want to explain why it was a download and not a meeting, because I had been in enough meetings by then to know exactly what a meeting was worth. If I had gone to Dean Bellamy with a folder, Dean would have gone to Gordon, and Gordon would have explained it warmly in about 4 minutes, the way he had explained everything to everybody in that depot for 19 years, and Dean would have come out of that office reassured, and the pad would have gone in a skip that afternoon. So I did not bring a folder to anybody. What I did instead is that I made 2 telephone calls in the last week of October. The first was to the DVSA to report as a transport manager on that operator's license a systemic failure of the daily walk-around check regime, which is a thing a transport manager is legally obliged to do and which ends her career at that company the moment she does it. The second was to the traffic commissioner's office, and on the 14th of November at 6:30 in the morning, on the depot floor, with 22 trucks in the yard and 40 people on shift, 2 vehicle examiners walked in unannounced with a laptop and a brake tester, and I stood next to them, and Dean Bellamy came out of the office in his socks. They did it live. That is what I want anybody who tells this story back to me to keep, because it is the whole reason it worked. Nobody read anything out. An examiner plugged a cable into KX68 HRD and pulled the vehicle unit data onto a screen on a trolley in front of everybody, and then they took it up the road to a test center that was not Gordon's brother-in-law's and put it on a roller brake tester. And the number came back at 11 o'clock in the morning, and the number was the number. And in between those 2 things, on that floor, in front of 40 people, an examiner asked me to state the basis of my report, and I said that I had formed a view in January that a driver was at fault, that I had pursued that view for 7 months, that it was wrong, that I had apologized to him, and that everything I had found since had come from records I should have opened in the first week. Sonia Bellamy said, "Marnie, you're going to bury us." I said, "I know." Dean said, 22 vehicles, 40 jobs. My father started this in 1979. And I said, "Dean, HRD is 18% down, and it does the Avon math run in the dark." And Gordon Leask, who had not said one word, said, "It was on the list." The examiner asked him when the rear axle advisory on HRD had last been actioned, and Gordon said it was on the list. The examiner asked to see the list. Gordon said it was not a written list. The examiner asked, and I will remember the exact wording of this until I die because it was so mild, whether the list was a document or a recollection. And Gordon Leask, who has forgotten more about brakes than that examiner will ever learn, who could have talked his way out of the pad in July, and did, stood in his own maintenance bay and could not produce 4 weeks of anything. And the examiner said, "Which list, Mr. Leask?" And Gordon said, "The list," and that was the entirety of his defense, on a depot floor at 7 in the morning, after 19 years, and I have thought about those 3 words more than any sentence anybody screamed at me that whole year. Then Ryan Petch, who had been standing at the back by the fuel pumps with 40 people between us, walked up the middle of that floor with a carrier bag from a supermarket that closed in 2019, and put it on the trolley next to the laptop and said, "Yellow copies, 4 years. 9 of them are that truck. The prohibition notices came in December. 11 vehicles were issued with immediate prohibitions on the day, and the fleet was effectively off the road for 9 days, and Bellamy Freight lost its 2 biggest contracts inside a month because a haulier that cannot move a load is not a haulier. The public inquiry before the traffic commissioner was in the spring and ran 3 days, and the operator's license was revoked, and Dean Bellamy was disqualified from holding a license for 4 years, and Gordon Leask was disqualified indefinitely as a transport manager and was prosecuted and pleaded guilty in the autumn to forgery and to offenses under the Road Traffic Act and got 16 months, of which he served 8, and he is 70 now. The company went under in the March and 31 people lost their jobs, and I know that number the way you know a number that is yours. 14 of them went to a firm in Cheltenham that took the drivers as a block because the drivers were never the problem. The test station where that fleet had gone since 2011 was investigated in the 2nd year and lost its authorization, and 2 other operators who used it had their fleets retested, and one of them had 4 vehicles fail immediately, and that operator has never been told why anybody looked, and I am the reason, and nobody will ever put that in a document. The traffic commissioner's written decision runs to 31 pages, and there is a paragraph on page 19 about the practice of completing walk-around checks centrally, and it is now cited in compliance training across this region. And I have sat in a hotel conference room and listened to a man read my own depot back to me out of a slide, anonymized as an example, and I did not say anything. Bellamy Freight's insurers repudiated 2 open claims on the maintenance findings. And Dillis Umbler, who poured me a cup of tea on the 9th of January and told me to get off the road, took redundancy at 58 and could not get another traffic desk because the whole thing was in the local paper, and her name was in it for no reason at all, except that she had worked there. And that is the single most unfair consequence of everything I did. And I have paid for her lunch every 6 weeks for 4 years, and neither of us has ever named it. Sonia Bellamy has not spoken to me since, and she has every right to that. Dean sent me a message 2 years later, 4 words long, which said, "You were right. Sorry," and I have not answered it, and I do not know if that is cruelty, or just that there is nothing to put. And I was not there for any of it, in the sense of having a job, because a transport manager who reports her own operator does not stay employed, and I was out by the end of November on a compromise agreement I signed in a car park. I work for a compliance consultancy now. I go into other people's depots and I look at their walk-around pads, and the first thing I do, in every single yard, before I say hello to the owner, is pick up the pad and turn it over and look at 40 sheets down, and about 1 in 6 times there it is. 5 weeks of a fleet's checks in one hand in one pen, and the conversation that follows is not a pleasant one, and I have never once softened it. And the 22nd of November came and went that year with nothing on it. No crash, no coroner, no road closed for 11 hours, nothing. It is a date that is famous inside my head and nowhere else, and every year I know exactly where I am on it. And every year I have to remember not to say anything to anybody. Ryan Petch drives for the Cheltenham firm. We are not friends. I have seen him 3 times in 4 years, twice at a services on the M5 and once at the public inquiry. And at the inquiry, in the corridor, he said the only thing about it he has ever said to me directly. He said, "You never did tell me what you thought I'd done." And I said, "No." And he waited, and I did not fill it. And he nodded once and went in. I have thought for 4 years about what I would say if I ever answered that question honestly, and the closest I have got is this. I came back with a name and I treated it as knowledge, and a name is not knowledge. It is somebody's answer to a question, and the only real question is who gave it to you, and what were they doing while you were busy being certain. I nearly took a man's job and his nights and his Wednesdays off him for a story I had been handed by the person who did it. Being dead did not make me right. It just made me sure. So here is what I want to know from you, because you have been in that yard with me the whole way. Did she go far enough, or was she still too merciful? Comment justice if the ending was perfect. Comment harder if you wanted an even colder revenge. Your comments decide how ruthless the next ending should be. Like and subscribe if you want to be here for the next.